You're still here. That already says more than you explain. You didn't arrive loudly. There was no moment where anyone stopped and noticed. No signal, no marker. Just this quiet fact that you're standing where you are, and you're not who you were before. Something tried to take you apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. It worked slowly, patiently, in ways that don't leave evidence. And yet, you're still here. You didn't win. You didn't escape cleanly. You didn't come out untouched. You adjusted. That was the cost. There's a version of you that didn't make it this far. You don't talk about that. You don't even think about it directly. But you feel the absence sometimes, like a room in a house you no longer enter. You learned when to go quiet, when to stop explaining, when to conserve what little was left. Not because you planned to, because something in you understood before you did. You endured, you adjusted, you remained. No one congratulated you for that. There was no acknowledgement, no moment where the weight was lifted and replaced with clarity. It just stayed, and you carried it anyway. Whatever tried to erase you failed quietly. That matters more than it sounds like it should. You don't announce survival like this. You don't frame it as strength. You don't turn it into a story that lands well when told out loud. It lives deeper than language. That's why most people never see it. You've noticed how some things don't reach you anymore. Not because you're numb, because they no longer apply in the same way. The old reactions don't show up on time. Sometimes they don't show up at all. That didn't happen overnight. It happened while you were busy holding things together, while you were making small, unremarkable decisions that no one remembers, except you. Your body remembers. You crossed something without ceremony. There was no line on the ground, no voice telling you to stop or continue. Just a shift you didn't name at the time. And now you're here, standing in it. This isn't the beginning. Beginnings feel lighter than this. This is the moment after something ended without closure. The space where you're still orienting yourself, still learning what stayed with you. You could leave now. Most people do when things aren't explained to them. They look for meaning they can hold immediately, or reassurance they can recognize. But that's not why you're here. You stayed once already, when leaving would have been easier. You endured, you adjusted, you remained. And that isn't finished speaking yet. There were losses you never named. Not because they weren't real, because naming them would have required someone to listen. And at some point, you stopped expecting that. You learned how to keep moving without ceremony, how to continue while something important stayed unresolved. You didn't announce the weight. You adjusted your posture around it. That adjustment became habit. You paid in silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that tightens around the throat before words can form. The kind that teaches you which thoughts are safe to finish and which ones are better left incomplete. There were moments you could have spoken. You remember them. The pauses where something almost came out, and then didn't. Not out of fear, out of calculation. You understood the cost of being misunderstood, of being reduced, of having something delicate handled carelessly. So you swallowed it instead. That was discipline. Even if no one called it that, you carried it. You carried it alone. Even now, there are things you don't revisit. Not because they're forbidden, because they're settled in a way that doesn't need reopening. You don't dramatize what it took to arrive here. You don't romanticize endurance. You know exactly what it cost because you paid it incrementally, quietly, over time. There's a steadiness in you that wasn't trained. It was forged by repetition, by continuing without relief, by staying present when disengaging would have been easier. That steadiness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be admired. It doesn't even ask to be understood. It just exists. And you feel it most in moments where nothing happens. When there's no pressure, no performance. Just you standing in the aftermath of everything you didn't say. You carried it. You carried it alone. And that weight shaped you in ways no one ever recorded. They expected something from you, a sound, a shift in posture, a visible sign that it landed. You felt the invitation immediately, the familiar pull toward response, toward explanation, toward defense. That pull was intentional. They waited for you to react, not because they needed your answer, because they needed your energy inside the moment they controlled. You recognized the setup before you recognized the feeling, the slight tightening in the chest, the urge to correct, to push back, to show you were still there. That was the test. Most people mistake provocation for conflict. You saw it for what it was, a request, a demand for access. You paused, not dramatically, not as a statement, just long enough to notice how much was being asked of you for how little it would return. You measured the situation without narrating it, measured the tone, the timing, the intention behind the words, and something changed. You realized reaction was the product, not resolution, not truth. Noise was the outcome they were counting on. They waited for you to react. You didn't give them that. That was the first refusal. It didn't feel powerful in the moment. It felt unfinished, almost uncomfortable. Silence tends to feel like absence when you're used to filling space. But this wasn't absence, it was containment. You felt the anger register. You didn't deny it. You didn't suppress it. You simply didn't release it where it would be used against you. That distinction mattered. You paused. You measured, you chose. The moment passed without resolution, and that unsettled them, because the script broke. They tried again later, different angle, different pressure, same expectation. They expected explanation, justification, a sign that they still had reach. You felt the echo of the old impulse rise again, familiar, efficient, tempting, and you didn't follow it. Not because you were calm, because you were clear. Clarity has weight. It slows things down. It makes reaction feel unnecessary. They waited for you to react. You didn't give them that. What replaced it wasn't indifference, it was distance. Distance creates imbalance. It removes leverage. It forces the other side to sit with their own momentum. You noticed how quickly pressure collapses when it isn't met halfway. You noticed how much of what felt personal was actually procedural, a pattern, a mechanism, a trigger looking for confirmation. You didn't confirm it. You paused, you measured, you chose. That choice didn't announce itself. It didn't resolve the moment cleanly. It left a quiet residue instead. A shift in how you were approached afterward, a hesitation, a recalculation. Not respect, not fear, uncertainty. And you didn't savor it. You didn't need to, because something else had already settled. You no longer reacted on cue. You no longer filled silence to make others comfortable. You no longer mistook urgency for importance. Control didn't arrive loudly. It arrived as refusal. And once you felt that, you couldn't unfeel it. You paused, you measured, You chose, and the world adjusted slightly around that fact. You didn't step into this lighter. You carried yourself here. Not in a way anyone noticed, not in a way that earned comment. You learned early that support is not always offered, and later that waiting for it costs more than moving without it. So you held yourself together. Not cleanly, not perfectly, just enough. There was no one to hand it back to, no place to set the weight down and return later. If you let go, it fell. If you paused too long, it shifted. So you adjusted. You became the thing you leaned on, not because you wanted to, because the alternative was collapse. That decision didn't feel noble, it felt necessary. You learned how to stay functional when no one was watching, how to keep pace when motivation thinned, how to keep your voice steady when the inside wasn't. That's a quiet skill. It doesn't show itself, it doesn't announce progress, but it accumulates. You held yourself through days that offered nothing back, through conversations that took more than they gave, through moments when stopping would have been reasonable. You didn't stop. Not because you were strong, because you were responsible. Responsible to the version of you that would exist tomorrow and inherit whatever you left unfinished. That kind of responsibility doesn't feel empowering, it feels isolating. There is no applause for restraint, no acknowledgement for consistency, no relief built into discipline. You noticed that. You noticed how often your steadiness was assumed, how quickly people leaned once they sensed it. You didn't resent them. You adjusted again. You learned the difference between being dependable and being available, between holding yourself and carrying others by default. That distinction took time and missteps. There were nights you wondered if becoming this contained was costing you something unnamed. You didn't dramatize it. You didn't speak it aloud. You kept moving. You held. You adjusted. You endured. Over time, something hardened. Not your heart, but your structure. You became predictable to yourself. You could trust your response, trust your follow-through. That reliability didn't come from confidence. It came from repetition, from doing the same quiet things even when no one would know. There was loneliness in that, not the kind that asks to be fixed, the kind that settles in and stays. You learned to live with it without turning it into a story. You didn't need an audience to keep going. You became your own witness, and that changed the weight, not by removing it, by redistributing it. You no longer carried yourself with the expectation of being relieved. You carried yourself because you could. You held, you adjusted, you endured. And in that process, you stopped asking who would save you. You already knew the answer. You didn't make a statement. You made space. Not the kind people notice right away. The kind that changes how you stand in a room. There was a moment, quiet, unmarked, when approval stopped carrying weight. Not because you were rejected, not because you were celebrated. It simply failed to matter. You noticed how often you were adjusting yourself to remain legible, how much energy went into being understood by people who were never listening. You stopped correcting them, not out of bitterness, out of accuracy. You realized approval was never protection. It didn't shield you, it didn't steady you, it only delayed clarity. So you let it go. You didn't announce the change. There was no explanation offered, no closing argument. You just stopped performing coherence for others. That silence unsettled some people, not because you were cold, because you were no longer available. You stopped asking to be seen, and in that pause, you saw yourself more clearly. You noticed how much of your identity had been shaped in response, how often your boundaries were negotiated instead of enforced. You didn't dramatize the realization, you withdrew, not in retreat, in recalibration. You clarified what required no defense, what didn't need translation, what stood even when unacknowledged. There was relief in that distance, not comfort, relief. The relief of no longer needing permission to be intact. You stopped explaining your decisions to make them palatable, stopped justifying your silence. You let misunderstanding exist. That was new. You learned that distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it means accuracy. You withdrew, you clarified, you stood. Not louder, not harder, cleaner. You noticed how conversations changed when you weren't seeking agreement, how reactions lost their leverage once you stopped negotiating your center. You didn't resent those who noticed. You didn't pursue those who didn't. You accepted the shift without commentary. There was a steadiness in that, a kind that doesn't require reinforcement. Approval became optional. Feedback became information, not instruction. You listened when it was useful, you let it pass when it wasn't. That boundary didn't come from confidence, it came from fatigue, from realizing how much of yourself was being spent on alignment that never settled. So you chose stillness over explanation, distance over defense. You didn't need to be seen to remain real. And once that became true, authority moved inward, quietly, permanently. You don't rush. That wasn't always true. There was a time when movement felt like proof, when acting fast felt necessary, like stillness meant losing ground. That changed, not suddenly, gradually, through consequence. You learned that force burns loud and brief. It leaves evidence. It leaves openings. Control doesn't. Control waits without tension. It doesn't need to be seen to be effective. It lets moments pass untouched. You stopped confusing urgency with importance. There were situations designed to provoke action, moments engineered to pull you forward, to make you show your hand. You didn't. Not because you were unsure, because you were precise. You realized most pressure isn't real. It's timing disguised as demand, impulse wearing the voice of necessity. You let it speak. You didn't answer. That restraint changed how outcomes unfolded, not immediately, but decisively. You watched how people rushed to fill silence, how movement replaced thought, how noise masked lack of direction. You stayed still. That wasn't passivity, it was leverage. You don't chase, because what matters doesn't need pursuit. It either aligns or it reveals itself as unnecessary. You learned when not to act, when to let situations resolve without interference, when to allow others to expose their intentions. Stillness became your filter. You noticed how timing sharpened your influence, how one decision placed correctly carried more weight than 10 reactions ever did. You didn't announce this shift. There was no discipline imposed from outside, no rule book. It became internal. You began to trust delay, not as avoidance, as selection. You wait, you decide. Impulse lost its appeal, intensity lost its authority. You stopped mistaking motion for control, stopped believing that speed meant strength. You chose accuracy. That choice made your presence quieter and harder to move. People felt it before they understood it, not as threat, as certainty. You don't rush conversations. You don't force conclusions. You let things arrive when they're ready to hold weight. That patience isn't gentle, it's exact. You learned that reacting gives power away. It hands the rhythm to someone else. It lets them set the pace. You reclaimed that. You decide when a moment matters. You decide when it ends. Everything else passes. You don't rush. You don't chase. You wait. You decide. And in that space, between impulse and action, control took root. Quietly. Completely.
You didn't disappear. That's the part they never understood. They looked for noise, for absence that could be named. They didn't find it. You were still there, just not available. There's a difference. You stopped placing yourself where everything could reach you, stopped being accessible by default, stopped answering every pull on your attention, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. You learned that presence is a choice, and choice requires distance. You didn't vanish from rooms, you changed how much of yourself entered them. You spoke less, listened more, watched patterns repeat without stepping in to interrupt them. That withdrawal wasn't retreat, it was refinement. You noticed how chaos depends on access, how noise survives on reaction, how demand weakens when it isn't answered. So you withheld. Not everything, just enough. You became selective with your energy, careful with where it landed, intentional with where it stayed. That made you harder to read and impossible to pull. People mistook that for distance, for coldness, for absence. It wasn't. It was sovereignty. You learned that privacy isn't secrecy, it's protection. It's deciding what remains internal and what never needs to be explained. You didn't owe visibility. You didn't owe access. You didn't owe presence to anyone who hadn't earned weight. So you stepped back, not away, back. Enough to see clearly, enough to let things reveal themselves without your involvement. You observed, you withheld, you remained. That restraint changed the balance. You were no longer reachable by urgency, no longer pulled by expectation, no longer shaped by external timing. You chose when to be available and when not to be. That choice carried authority, not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need confirmation. You didn't announce your absence. You didn't defend your silence. You let the space speak, and it did. What mattered found you anyway. What didn't fell quiet. You noticed how much energy you recovered by not being everywhere, how much clarity came from not explaining yourself, how strength settled when it wasn't constantly expressed. You became unreachable to chaos, not because chaos disappeared, because it couldn't get close enough to matter. You didn't disappear, you became unavailable. Unavailable to noise, unavailable to pressure, unavailable to anything that required you to fracture yourself just to belong. You remained intact. You observed. You withheld. You remained. And in that distance, not isolation, but intention, your presence gained weight. Not because it was rare, because it was deliberate. You were never absent. You were choosing where you exist.
You didn't lose yourself. That's the truth no one saw coming. Everything pressed against you. Every expectation, every judgment, every moment that whispered, you should break here. You didn't. You stayed intact. Not by accident, not by waiting for rescue, not by hoping someone would notice. You learned control. Control of your thoughts, control of your reactions, control of the quiet space between impulse and action. No one applauded. No one marked the changes. No one recorded the moments you held yourself together when nothing in the world was asking you to. And still, you did it. You didn't remake yourself. You didn't erase the edges that were inconvenient. You didn't discard what made you fragile. You refined it, sharpened it, polished the parts that were yours, the ones that had always been. Change came to you, and you didn't resist it, but it didn't redefine you. It passed through. It shaped without replacing. You stayed intact. You stayed grounded when the ground moved beneath you. You stayed measured when chaos tried to dictate your pulse. You stayed whole when others assumed you were fragmenting. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about being yourself, deeper, more deliberate, undeniably you. You didn't need reconstruction. You didn't need permission. You didn't need anyone to understand the process. You stayed intact. The parts that could have been lost, confidence, integrity, clarity, weren't. They were refined through endurance, through deliberate patience, through the quiet discipline of not letting circumstance define you. You didn't disappear in adaptation. You didn't hollow out to fit expectation. You evolved. You grew. You became the self you were meant to be, intact, unbroken, fully present. You learned control, not over others, not over the world, over yourself. Every choice measured, every moment accounted for, every reaction deliberate. You stayed intact. And in that stillness, in that quiet certainty, the world's assumptions no longer hold power. The noise no longer pulls. The pressure no longer shapes. You are whole. You are unshaken. You are intact. You didn't lose yourself. You stayed intact. You don't react, not because nothing reaches you, but because it doesn't enter the center anymore. There was a time when every sound mattered. Every opinion shifted something inside you. Every interruption pulled at your attention, demanded a response, asked you to clarify who you were. That time is gone. You notice things now without moving toward them. Words land and fall away. Gestures happen and expire on their own. You don't chase resolution. You don't rush to correct the story. You don't step forward when bait is placed in front of you. You let it sit. That's when it becomes obvious who is uncomfortable with silence, who needs reaction to feel real, who collapses without friction. You watch and you wait. Not strategically, not performatively, naturally. You no longer mistake urgency for importance. You no longer confuse volume with authority. You don't confuse attention with presence. You stand. There is a strange thing that happens when you stop responding the way you're expected to. People reveal themselves faster. They overreach. They explain too much. They escalate when nothing is required. You don't interrupt the process. You don't explain. Explanation used to feel necessary, like proof, like defense. Now it feels intrusive. You understand that power doesn't clarify itself. It doesn't rush to be known. It doesn't justify its position. It occupies it. You stand. You don't signal dominance. You don't hint at it. You don't posture or posture-adjacent behaviors. You simply don't move. And the world adjusts around that. Some mistake it for indifference. Others mistake it for distance. Both are wrong. This calm is active. It's alert. It's listening without leaning forward. You are aware of every shift in the room, every subtle attempt to pull you in, every unspoken expectation waiting for you to fulfill a role you've already outgrown. You decline without saying no. You don't argue boundaries. You embody them. That's when the noise loses leverage, when it realizes it has nowhere to land. You stand. There is no rush inside you anymore, no internal negotiation, no background hum of needing to be seen correctly. You are already aligned. The calm doesn't come from control over others. It comes from control over access. Who gets a response? Who gets proximity? Who gets energy? Most get none. Not as punishment, as fact. You let moments pass unfinished. You let tension resolve itself, or not at all. You don't need closure from people who never held the full picture. You don't need recognition from environments that thrive on reaction. You stand, still, clear, unmoved. And in that stillness, everything loud becomes irrelevant. You didn't lose yourself. Not in the years where nothing seemed to move. Not in the moments where silence felt like failure. Not when the world rewarded noise and overlooked restraint. You remained. While others adapted themselves into something unrecognizable, you stayed intact. You bent where bending was necessary, but you never broke your spine. You learned when to withdraw, when to watch, when to conserve. That wasn't weakness, that was intelligence. There were seasons where nothing came back to you. No acknowledgement, no applause, no reassurance that your discipline meant anything at all. And still, you held your line. You didn't explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You didn't chase validation from rooms that fed on attention. You didn't dilute your standards just to belong somewhere temporarily. You learned the most difficult skill of all, to exist without witnesses. That kind of self-possession doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg to be seen. It doesn't need to be defended. It settles into the body quietly, like weight that can't be moved. You stopped reacting, stopped correcting, stopped proving. Not because you gave up, but because you outgrew the need. There is a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when a person realizes they no longer require permission. No permission to be distant, no permission to be selective, no permission to remain unmoved by things that once controlled them. That moment happened to you. You don't carry resentment. You don't carry regret. You don't even carry anger the way you used to. You carry clarity. And clarity is heavy. It changes how you walk into rooms, how you listen, how you decide who gets access and who never will again. Some will mistake your calm for emptiness. Others will mistake your silence for absence. They are wrong. You are present. You are aware. You are finished negotiating your worth. Nothing was wasted. Not the waiting, not the restraint, not the loneliness that sharpened you when nothing else could. You didn't disappear. You consolidated. You are still here, not louder, not softer, not asking to be understood. Just solid, just grounded, just unmovable. And that is the final position.